I'm standing in a ballroom that probably costs more per night than most people make in a year, wearing the most expensive dress I've ever owned, watching my mother-in-law Victoria tell 300 wedding guests that my family doesn't belong here. Some people, she says with that fake smile plastered on her face, simply weren't raised with proper appreciation for refined society. She's looking directly at my parents when she says it, and I can see my dad's face turning red with embarrassment. What Victoria didn't know was that in exactly 10 minutes, the wedding photographer was going to make an announcement that would expose her deepest, most shameful secret in front of every socialite, business partner, and family friend she'd spent decades trying to impress. But let me start from the beginning, because this story is about more than just one moment of revenge. It's about discovering that the people who judge you the loudest often have the most to hide. My name is Bethany Carson, and 6 months ago I married Owen Whitmore, the love of my life. Owen is everything I could have asked for, kind, hardworking, and completely devoted to our relationship. The problem isn't Owen. The problem is his mother, Victoria Whitmore, who decided I wasn't good enough for her precious son. I come from a working-class family. My father, Robert Chen, owns a small auto repair shop that's been in our family for 2 generations. My mother, Linda Chen, worked as an elementary school teacher for 30 years. They live in a modest ranch house where neighbors still wave from their front porches. Owen and I met in college, where I studied business administration on partial scholarship while working at the campus library. Owen was there studying international finance on his family's dime. Despite our different backgrounds, we connected over shared interests, and he never made me feel inferior for having to budget everything. The Whitmore estate is a sprawling Tudor mansion with manicured gardens and a circular driveway. Victoria Whitmore is perfectly coiffed, impeccably dressed, and armed with the kind of subtle cruelty that comes from inherited wealth. From our first meeting, Victoria made her feelings clear. She'd ask pointed questions about my background and make comments about how interesting it must be to come from such a different kind of family. "I'm sure you're a lovely girl, Bethany," she said during one visit. "But Owen has certain expectations for his future. He's been raised with particular standards." Owen's father, Charles, was subtly dismissive of my career goals. His sister Penelope, married to investment banker Garrett Morrison, perfected backhanded compliments about my brave clothing choices and how refreshing it was to meet someone so unaffected by material things. But Owen stood by me, defending me against their comments and making clear that their approval wasn't required. When he proposed with a modest ring he'd saved months to buy, I said yes without hesitation. That's when Victoria took over wedding planning, insisting that a Whitmore wedding required standards my family couldn't understand. She booked the most expensive venue without consulting us, hired elite vendors, and made guest list decisions that minimized my family's presence while maximizing her social circle. Every conversation became a reminder of our differences. Victoria would suggest vendors costing more than my parents' annual income, then act surprised at budget concerns. My parents tried to contribute financially, but Victoria dismissed their offers with condescension. "How sweet," she'd say, "but Charles and I insist on handling everything. We wouldn't want you to strain yourselves." The worst part was watching my parents absorb these insults with grace. My father, who'd built a successful business and put 2 daughters through college, would nod politely when Victoria explained why his suggestions weren't suitable. My mother would smile when Victoria suggested she practice proper etiquette. Owen tried to intervene, but Victoria was too skilled at manipulation. She wrapped everything in language about wanting the best and ensuring perfection. When confronted, she'd act hurt and confused. As the wedding approached, I dreaded what should have been the happiest day of my life. Victoria had made me feel like an outsider at my own wedding, and I knew she was planning to remind everyone, especially my family, exactly where we stood in her hierarchy. I had no idea her plan would backfire so spectacularly, or that the person who would expose her wasn't someone she'd ever seen coming. The wedding was held at the Grand Meridian Ballroom, a venue so exclusive they don't list prices. Everything screamed luxury: crystal chandeliers, silk linens, floral arrangements like museum pieces. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's elite, all orchestrated by Victoria to showcase Whitmore wealth and status. My family looked exactly like what they were: hard-working, middle-class people trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for them. My father wore his best suit from my college graduation. My mother had splurged on a department store dress. My sister Rachel, my maid of honor and PhD student, looked completely out of place among Victoria's chosen bridesmaids. The tension started during cocktail hour. Victoria worked the room like a politician, introducing my parents with descriptions that made them sound quaint rather than respectable. "This is Linda Chen, Bethany's mother," Victoria would say brightly. "She worked with children for years. So noble, dedicating yourself to public service." The way she said public service made it sound like charity work. When someone asked about my father's business, Victoria would interrupt. "Robert has such an interesting little auto shop, very hands-on work. It's refreshing to meet someone who's not afraid to get his hands dirty." My parents navigated these conversations with more grace than Victoria deserved, but I could see the strain in their faces. They knew they were being patronized. The ceremony went smoothly, but Victoria's disapproval radiated from the front row. The real problem started at the reception. Victoria had insisted on formal dining with multiple wine courses, each explained by a sommelier. I watched my family try to follow elaborate descriptions of notes and terroir. During the salad course, Victoria stood for a welcoming toast about family traditions, maintaining standards, and Owen settling with someone who appreciates the finer things. Every word emphasized our differences. "Marriage is about more than love," Victoria announced. "It's about compatibility, shared values, and maintaining standards passed down through generations." She looked directly at my parents. As the evening progressed, her comments became increasingly pointed. During toasts, she referenced Owen's distinguished education and refined upbringing. When guests complimented the wedding, she'd mention doing things properly and maintaining elegance. The breaking point came during dancing. The band played sophisticated jazz, and most guests engaged in formal ballroom dancing. My parents, who'd learned to dance at their modest wedding 35 years ago, were clearly struggling. That's when Victoria struck with surgical precision. She approached my parents with her country club friends. "Linda, Robert," she said with fake warmth, "you must be so proud to see Bethany in such beautiful surroundings. I imagine this is quite different from what you're used to." "It's a lovely celebration, Victoria," my mother replied politely. "You've done a beautiful job." "Well, it's important to do these things properly," Victoria said. "Some people simply weren't raised with proper appreciation for refined society. But that makes events like this so educational." The comment poisoned the air. Nearby guests exchanged glances. My father's face turned red. My mother looked slapped. "Of course," Victoria continued, "not everyone can understand the nuances of elegant entertaining. It's about breeding and exposure, isn't it? Some things simply can't be taught later in life." My sister Rachel started to step forward angrily, but my mother caught her arm. Even in humiliation, my parents refused to make a scene. Victoria had succeeded. She'd reminded everyone exactly where my family stood in her world, with enough plausible deniability to dismiss any confrontation as oversensitive. But someone had been watching this performance with growing disgust. Someone with inside knowledge that could destroy Victoria's carefully constructed image in seconds, and that someone was about to act. The photographer Victoria had hired wasn't just any society photographer. Marcus Rivera was one of the most respected wedding photographers in the industry, known not just for his artistic eye, but for his discretion with high-profile clients. He'd been documenting elite weddings for over 15 years, and his portfolio read like a directory of the city's most prominent families. What Victoria didn't know was that Marcus had a very personal reason for being at this wedding, and it had nothing to do with photography. I first noticed something was wrong when I saw Marcus's expression during Victoria's refined society comment to my parents. Instead of the professional neutrality you'd expect from a vendor, his face showed barely contained anger. He'd stopped taking photos and was staring at Victoria with an intensity that seemed completely out of place for someone who was supposedly just documenting the evening. During a brief break in the reception, when most guests were either dancing or networking on the terrace, I found myself standing near the bar when Marcus approached me. His usual professional demeanor had been replaced by something much more serious. "Mrs. Carson," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you about something important. It concerns your mother-in-law, and some information I think you should know." I looked around nervously, making sure Victoria was nowhere in sight. "What kind of information?" Marcus glanced around the room, then leaned closer. 23 years ago, I photographed a very different kind of wedding. A small ceremony at City Hall, very private, very quiet. The bride was young, maybe 19, and she was clearly from a working-class family. Her dress was simple, probably borrowed, and her family looked like they were struggling financially. I had no idea where this was going, but something about Marcus's tone made me pay attention. "The groom was a young man named Vincent Torres," Marcus continued. "He was a construction worker, maybe 21 years old, with calloused hands and a rental tuxedo that didn't quite fit. They seemed very much in love, but it was obvious that money was tight. The bride's mother had tears in her eyes and during the whole ceremony, and not the happy kind." Marcus paused, watching my expression carefully. "The bride's name was Victoria Castellano. She's now known as Victoria Whitmore." I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your mother-in-law, who's been lecturing your family about breeding and proper society, was once exactly like them. She married her first husband in a courthouse ceremony that cost less than 1 bottle of wine being served at this reception." My mind was racing. Her first husband? "But Victoria's been married to Charles for 22 years, Marcus finished. "She divorced Vincent Torres after 11 months of marriage. Court records show she cited irreconcilable differences. But the real reason was that she'd met Charles Whitmore at a charity fundraiser where she was working as temporary catering staff. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was ugly. She left her first husband for Charles's money." Marcus nodded grimly. Vincent was devastated. He'd used his life savings to put a down payment on a small house for them, and he was working double shifts trying to build a future. Victoria walked away from all of it without looking back. "How do you know all this?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "Because Vincent Torres was my uncle," Marcus said, his voice heavy with old anger. "He never recovered from what Victoria did to him. He spent years trying to understand why the woman he loved had abandoned him the moment someone with more money came along. He died 5 years ago, still carrying that heartbreak." I stared at Marcus, processing this revelation. "And you recognized her?" "The moment I saw her name on the contract for this wedding. I'd heard about the society queen Victoria Whitmore, but I never made the connection until I started researching the family for this event. When I realized it was the same woman who destroyed my uncle's life, I knew I had to do something." Marcus reached into his camera bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "I've spent the last 3 months gathering documentation. Marriage certificates, divorce records, photographs from that courthouse wedding. Everything is here." He handed me the envelope, and I could feel its weight like it was made of lead. "Your mother-in-law has spent 2 decades building an identity based on a lie," Marcus said. "She's erased her past completely, pretending she was born into the world she married into. She's reinvented herself so thoroughly that even her current husband probably doesn't know the truth about her background." I looked across the ballroom at Victoria, who was holding court near the wedding cake, surrounded by admiring guests who hung on her every word about proper etiquette and social standards. The woman who'd just finished humiliating my parents for their working-class origins was herself the product of that same background. "What do you want me to do with this?" I asked Marcus. "That's entirely up to you," he said. "But I will say this. Your parents have shown more grace and dignity tonight than Victoria Whitmore has shown in her entire adult life. They've been true to themselves while she's built an empire on deception." Marcus paused, then added, "I'm scheduled to make a brief announcement during the cake cutting, thanking the family for choosing me to document this special day. The microphone will be mine for about 2 minutes. If you want the truth to come out, I can make that happen." I looked down at the envelope in my hands, then across the room at my parents who were standing quietly near our table, trying to look comfortable in a world that had made it clear they didn't belong. I thought about Victoria's cruel comments, her deliberate humiliation, her years of making me feel inferior for coming from the same kind of background she'd apparently tried so hard to escape. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. "Do it," I said quietly. "But I want to be standing right next to her when you do." The cake-cutting ceremony was scheduled for 9 o'clock after the main course, but before the dancing reached its peak. Victoria had insisted on a 5-tier masterpiece created by the city's most exclusive pastry chef, decorated with sugar flowers that looked so realistic you could mistake them for the actual orchids surrounding the base. As guests gathered around the ornate cake table, Victoria positioned herself front and center, clearly planning to be the focal point of this traditional moment. She'd changed from her earlier outfit into an even more elaborate evening gown, as if she were the bride herself. Charles stood beside her, looking slightly uncomfortable with all the attention but playing his part as the proud patriarch. Owen and I approached the cake table, and I caught Marcus's eye across the crowd. He gave me a slight nod, confirming that he was ready. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it, but I forced myself to smile and play the part of the happy bride. Victoria took charge of the moment, as I'd known she would. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced in her crystal, clear voice that had been trained by years of elocution lessons, "if I could have your attention, please." The room quieted, and all eyes turned toward us. I could see my parents standing near the back of the crowd, still looking slightly out of place but trying to smile for their daughter's sake. "Before we continue with this lovely tradition," Victoria continued, "I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for being here to celebrate Owen and Bethany's union. Marriage is such a sacred institution, requiring careful consideration of compatibility, values, and the importance of maintaining the standards that have been passed down through generations." She was launching into another one of her subtle lectures about breeding and proper society. I could see several guests nodding along, and I noticed more than a few glances directed toward my family's section of the crowd. "As Owen's mother," Victoria said, warming to her theme, "I've tried to instill in him an appreciation for refinement, for the finer things in life, for the importance of—" She paused dramatically. "Well, let's just say that some things simply can't be taught. They must be bred into you from birth." That was my cue. I stepped closer to Victoria, positioning myself so that I'd have a clear view of her face when the bomb dropped. Marcus stepped forward with his microphone, exactly as planned. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely. "And thank you to both families for choosing me to document this special day." Victoria smiled graciously, clearly expecting a standard vendor thank you speech. "As a photographer," Marcus continued, "I've had the privilege of documenting many important family celebrations over the years. It's always interesting to see how families grow and change over time, how people evolve and sometimes reinvent themselves completely." I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross Victoria's face. Something in Marcus's tone wasn't quite right. "In fact," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, "sometimes I have the fascinating experience of photographing the same person at very different stages of their life. Different names, different circumstances, completely different stories." The room was dead silent now. Guests sensed that something significant was happening, even if they weren't sure what. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. 23 years ago, I had the honor of photographing a beautiful young bride named Victoria Castellano. She was 19 years old, marrying a construction worker named Vincent Torres in a simple courthouse ceremony. Victoria's face went absolutely white. The smile froze on her lips, and I could see her hands starting to shake. "It was a lovely wedding, Marcus," continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. Very modest, very heartfelt. The bride wore a simple dress that had been borrowed from her cousin, and the groom had saved up for months to buy her a small diamond ring from a pawn shop. Guests were starting to murmur, putting the pieces together. Charles was staring at his wife with complete confusion, and I could see Penelope's mouth hanging open in shock. The bride's family was working class, Marcus said, holding up the old photograph so everyone could see it. Her father worked in a factory, and her mother cleaned houses to help make ends meet. They were good, hard-working people who raised a daughter with strong values and a loving heart. Victoria tried to speak, but no sound came out. She was trapped, unable to deny what everyone could now see, the undeniable proof of her origins. Unfortunately, Marcus continued, that marriage ended after 11 months when Victoria met a wealthy man at a charity event, where she was working as temporary catering staff. She divorced Vincent Torres and reinvented herself completely, erasing her past as if it had never existed. The ballroom had erupted in whispers and shocked conversations. I could see guests looking back and forth between the old photograph and Victoria's horrified face. Vincent Torres was my uncle, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the weight of years of suppressed anger. He spent the rest of his life wondering why the woman he loved had abandoned him for money. He died 5 years ago, still heartbroken by the betrayal. Marcus looked directly at Victoria, his professional mask finally dropping completely. So when I heard Mrs. Victoria Whitmore lecturing this beautiful family about breeding and proper society, about how some things can't be taught and must be bred into you from birth, I felt my uncle deserved to have his story told. The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria swayed slightly, and Charles reached out to steady her, though his face showed he was still processing the revelation that his wife of 22 years had been living a complete lie. The Chen family, Marcus said, gesturing toward my parents, has shown more genuine class and dignity tonight than I've witnessed in years of photographing high society events. They've remained true to themselves and their values, even when faced with condescension and cruelty. My father's face was a mixture of shock and vindication. My mother had tears in her eyes, but for the first time all evening, she was standing tall with her shoulders back. Marcus handed the microphone back to the wedding coordinator and walked away, leaving Victoria standing in front of 300 guests with her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Guests began talking among themselves, some pulling out their phones to share this incredible gossip with people who weren't there. Others were openly staring at Victoria, who stood frozen beside the untouched wedding cake like a statue. Charles finally found his voice. "Victoria," he said quietly, but in the silent room, everyone heard him. "Is this true?" Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no way to explain away a photograph and documented marriage records, no way to spin this into anything other than what it was, a complete deception that had lasted over 2 decades. Penelope was the first family member to react. "Mother," she hissed, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "How could you do this to us? How could you build our entire family reputation on a lie?" But it was Owen who surprised everyone the most. My new husband stepped forward, took the microphone, and looked out at the assembled guests with complete calm. "Well," he said with a slight smile, "I think we've all learned something important tonight about the difference between having class and acting classy. and I couldn't be more proud to be marrying into the Chen family. The applause that followed was scattered at first, but it grew stronger as guests realized that the evening's real story wasn't about Victoria's deception. It was about the dignity and grace my family had shown in the face of her cruelty. The reception continued with whispered conversations, early departures, and social media posts that would make this legendary gossip for years. Victoria disappeared around 10 o'clock, claiming sudden illness that fooled no one. Charles remained for appearances, but his shell-shocked expression revealed his marriage would never recover. Penelope left immediately after Victoria's exit, but not before approaching my parents with what might have been her first genuine apology. "I'm so sorry," she told my mother quietly. "Everything tonight, everything this past year. You've been nothing but gracious, and we've been horrible." In the following months, the story spread through Victoria's social circles. The woman who'd lectured others about breeding was revealed to be exactly what she'd mocked: working-class origins erased by marriage. Charles filed for divorce within 2 months, citing fraud. Victoria lost the house, assets, and social standing she'd spent decades building. The revelation completely changed how Owen's family treated us. People who'd looked down on my parents suddenly saw them as dignified victims. My father's auto shop gained high-end clients from the wedding guest list. Apparently there's appeal in a mechanic who maintains dignity under pressure. Owen and I moved to a different part of the city, building friendships based on genuine connection rather than social climbing. My parents finally got the respect they'd always deserved. My father's wisdom made him a valued advisor to business owners who'd previously dismissed him. My mother earned positions on community boards where she could make real differences. Marcus Rivera became legendary in photography circles. The story of exposing a socialite's fake identity spread through professional networks. But Marcus didn't care about career consequences. He'd gotten justice for his uncle Vincent. 6 months later, Vincent's sister Maria visited us with a box of photographs and letters Vincent had kept. "He never stopped loving her," Maria said tearfully. "Even after understanding she'd married him for money, he kept hoping she'd remember who she used to be." The photographs showed a young Victoria who seemed genuinely happy and proud of her working-class family. Somewhere, that girl had disappeared, replaced by someone so ashamed of her origins she'd built her life on rejection of everything she'd been. The most powerful moment came when Maria shared Vincent's unsent final letter forgiving Victoria, but expressing sadness about her complete erasure of their past. "You were beautiful as Victoria Castellano," he'd written. "Your family was good people, and you should have been proud of where you came from. Today, Owen and I have built an honest marriage based on mutual respect and appreciation for our backgrounds. Our children will know their grandparents' stories, understanding that worth comes from character, not bank accounts. My parents have become respected community pillars, known for wisdom and authenticity. They never gloated about Victoria's downfall, but they learned about the difference between having money and having class. The wedding meant to showcase Victoria's superiority revealed her deepest insecurities. Her attempt to humiliate my family backfired into a cautionary tale about building identity on lies. The most important lesson came from watching my parents that evening. They faced cruelty with grace, maintained dignity under attack, and never stooped to pettiness. They showed real class, not inherited, but earned through integrity and respect for others. Marcus gave us a wedding gift money couldn't buy: the truth. That truth didn't just expose Victoria's deception, it revealed my family's strength and character in ways wealth never could. Victoria spent 23 years escaping her past, but it caught up publicly. The girl who'd once married for love became a woman willing to destroy others for status, and justice had something to say about that transformation. We learned the best celebrations aren't about impressing people or showcasing wealth. They're about love and gathering people who matter. Our first anniversary party was smaller, but filled with people who loved us authentically. Victoria never experienced being loved for her real self, rather than her facade. In shaming my family for being exactly who they were, she revealed she'd forgotten her own identity entirely. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply letting truth emerge and watching people's actions destroy their own lies. Victoria's downfall wasn't planned. It was her cruelty meeting daylight. In that light, my family's authentic dignity outshone all of Victoria's artificial refinement combined.